Welcome back, history lovers. Or, if you're new here, hello and welcome. You've just stepped into Chronicles of the Forgotten, where the past isn't just remembered, it lives. Today, we're traveling to a village lost to time, a place where ordinary people faced an unthinkable choice when the Black Death came knocking. This isn't just history, it's a story of fire, sacrifice, and the unbreakable human spirit. So, light a candle, settle in, and let's step into the shadows of Eldenbrook, where the last act of defiance was written in flames. Don't forget to subscribe, because history always has another secret to reveal. Now, let's begin.
The first frost had not yet settled when the whispers began, a murmur, low and uneasy, slinking through the thatched roofs and muddy lanes of Eldenbrook, carried on the breath of travelers whose eyes darted too quickly, whose hands clutched their cloaks too tightly. The village was small, a cluster of homes huddled like sheep against the wind, bound by the rhythm of harvest and prayer. But now a new rhythm took hold, a slow, creeping dread, a horror they could not see. It began with a child. Little Annette, barely 6 winters old, had been chasing geese by the river bank when the coughing started. By dusk, her skin was the color of spoiled milk, her breath coming in shallow, fevered gasps. Her mother pressed cool cloths to her brow, whispering prayers that grew more desperate as the night stretched on. But the sickness did not listen. It never did. By the time the priest arrived, his robes damp with the morning mist, the plague had already coiled around 3 more homes. The air inside was thick with the scent of sweat and something darker, something rancid, like meat left too long in the sun. The dying writhed on straw pallets, their fingers clawing at invisible things in the air. Some swore they saw shadows moving in the corners of their vision. Others simply wept, their voices raw from screaming. The elders gathered in the dim glow of the church, their faces flickering in the candlelight like ghosts already half gone. The stone walls, once a refuge, now felt like a tomb. They spoke in hushed tones of stories from the east, of cities where the dead outnumbered the living, where carts piled high with bodies rolled through the streets at dawn. The Lord's messenger had brought word no one was to leave, no one was to enter. Eldenbrook was to be sealed away, left to its fate. Outside, the wind howled through the bare branches of the oaks, a sound like a wounded animal. The blacksmith's wife, Marta, stood in the doorway of her home, her hands still stained with the soot of her trade. She had buried her brother that morning. The grave was shallow. There had been no time to dig deeper. She watched as the priest moved from house to house, anointing the dying with oil that glistened like tears in the dim light. His voice trembled as he recited the last rites. Even God, it seemed, was faltering. That night, as the village groaned under the weight of its suffering, a decision was made, not in the church, not in the Lord's hall, but in the silence between heartbeats, in the spaces where fear and resolve collided.
Marta walked to the granary, her boots sinking into the mud. In her hand, a torch flickered, its light casting her shadow long and trembling against the weathered wood. She paused just for a moment, listening to the distant cries of the sick, the muffled sobs of those who still clung to hope. Then she touched the flame to the straw. The fire caught quickly, hungrily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The dry thatch blackened and curled, the heat pressing against her skin like a living thing. She did not run. She stood there, watching as the flames licked higher, as the smoke coiled into the sky like a soul released. The villagers emerged from their homes, their faces gaunt in the orange glow. No one shouted. No one tried to stop her. They simply watched, their eyes reflecting the firelight, their silence louder than any scream. One by one, they joined her. Torches were lit. Homes were set ablaze. The flames did not discriminate. They consumed the sick and the healthy alike, the hovels of the poor and the storehouses of the rich. There would be no graves, no markers, only ash, carried away on the wind. In the distance, the church bell tolled once, a hollow, broken sound. Then it too was swallowed by the roar of the fire. By dawn, Eldenbrook was gone. Only the stones remained, blackened and cracked, the last witnesses to a village that had chosen its own ending. The fields stood empty, the river flowed on, and somewhere, far away, a traveler would catch the scent of smoke on the wind and quicken his step. But here there was only silence, and the crows, circling patiently, their wings dark against the rising sun. They found the first body at dawn, slumped against the village well, fingers curled like claws in the dirt, as if still begging for water that would never come. The baker's boy saw it first, his scream shattering the fragile peace of Eldenbrook's waking hours.
The village had known hunger, had known winter's cruel bite when the frost crept under doors and old men disappeared into the white silence, never to return. But this was different. This death came not with the slow resignation of cold or famine, but as a thief in the night, stealing breath from lungs, leaving behind only the stench of rot and the hollow-eyed stares of those who remained. Agatha the midwife came when called, her hands gnarled as knotted rope after 60 winters of bringing life into the world, pressing against the corpse's neck. No pulse, only the terrible, yielding softness of flesh already turning. She crossed herself with fingers that trembled just slightly before reaching into her pouch of herbs. Wormwood and sage, she muttered, pressing the bitter leaves into the hands of those gathered. Burn it at your thresholds, keep the window shuttered. But the sickness did not listen to old remedies. It never did. By noon, 2 more had fallen. The cooper's youngest daughter, who had danced at Mayfair just weeks before. The tanner, strong as an ox, now writhing on his dirt floor as black boils flowered beneath his skin. The church bell tolled endlessly, its mournful voice echoing across fields where no one worked, where sheep wandered untended through the barley. The midwife moved from house to house, her satchel growing lighter with each stop. She pressed sour herbs to fevered lips, whispered prayers that sounded more like pleas. In the dim light of sick rooms, she saw the same scene repeated, the trembling hands reaching for her, the desperate eyes begging for answers she didn't have. "Will it take me too?" a young mother whispered, her sweat-soaked shift clinging to limbs already grown thin. Agatha had no answer, only a damp cloth and the lie that help was coming. When the Lord's messenger arrived, his horse lathered in sweat and stumbling with exhaustion, he brought no physicians, no miraculous cures from distant monasteries, only words delivered from a safe distance
as he pressed a vinegar-soaked cloth to his face. "Burn the dead," he called, his voice muffled. "Burn the houses where they've lain. The Lord commands it." A wail went up from the women gathered. Burn their homes, their memories, the cradle where generations had rocked their babies. The messenger didn't stay to argue. He turned his mount sharply, spurring it back down the road as if the devil himself gave chase. As the sun bled into the horizon, staining the sky the color of a fresh bruise, the villagers gathered what little they could carry. A young boy clutched a wooden horse his father had carved, the paint worn smooth from years of small hands loving it. A girl folded her mother's wedding veil carefully into her sleeve, the yellowed lace catching on her calloused fingers. An old man pressed his forehead to the hearthstone of his cottage, whispering secrets to the ghosts that would soon live there without him. Then came the torches. They moved through Eldenbrook like a procession of damned souls, each flame a tiny sun in the gathering dark. The thatch caught quickly, sending sparks swirling up to dance with the first stars. The flames did not weep. They roared, a great bellowing voice that spoke of endings, of terrible necessities, of love so fierce it would rather destroy than watch slow suffering. From the edge of the forest, where the refugees huddled together with their pitiful bundles, the village burned like a candle on an altar. The firelight painted their faces in shifting hues of gold and shadow, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, in the dark of the trees, an owl called, a low, mournful sound that might have been a lament or a warning to whatever lay ahead. And in the ashes of Eldenbrook, something stirred. Not life, not yet, but the wind, rising from the east, carrying embers and memory toward the next unsuspecting village down the road. 3 days since the bell last rang. 3 days since its iron tongue had called the faithful to prayer, marked births and deaths, measured time in steady, holy increments. Now only silence hung in the air, thick, suffocating, louder than any toll could ever be. Father Thomas stood in the empty church, his fingers working the rosary beads until they grew warm from friction. The familiar rhythm of prayer had become his anchor, the only thing keeping him from drowning in the rising tide of death. His robes, once white as lamb's wool, were stiff with dirt and something darker, the grime of 7 graves dug in a single day. Outside, the village of Eldenbrook was unraveling. The sickness took them all without distinction. The baker, whose hands had kneaded dough for 30 winters, now lay cold in the earth. The cooper's daughter, her laughter once bright as spring water, silenced forever. Even old Marta, the widow who fed stray dogs crusts of bread, had succumbed, her body found curled around an empty bowl, as if waiting for one last grateful lick.
A cough echoed through the nave. Father Tomas turned to see young Willem, the blacksmith's boy, slumped against a pew. The lad's face shone with sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps that rattled like dry reeds in winter. "Father, will it hurt?" the boy whispered. Tomas knelt, pressing a damp cloth to Willem's forehead. The skin burned beneath his fingers. "Like falling asleep," he lied, his voice cracking like the old church timbers. As night fell, the last candle guttered out, its dying breath sending shadows dancing across the frescoed saints. In the sudden dark,
something shifted in the villagers' hearts. Not fear, not resignation, but a terrible, quiet resolve. They moved through the empty streets like ghosts, carrying armfuls of dry straw. No words were spoken, none were needed. When the last bundle was laid against the church walls, a single torch was lit. Its flame reflected in a dozen pairs of eyes, some brimming with tears, others hard as flint. "God will understand," murmured Elin, the weaver's wife, as she touched the fire to the kindling. The thatch caught quickly, flames racing up the ancient beams like sinners toward judgment. Inside, Father Tomas heard the crackle of hungry fire, saw the first tendrils of smoke curling beneath the door. He pulled Willem closer, humming a lullaby his own mother had sung. Outside, the villagers stood shoulder to shoulder as their church burned, not in despair, not in madness, but in a terrible, beautiful defiance. A final act of love that would deny the plague its last victims. The flames reached heavenward, carrying with them prayers and memories and the last breaths of those within. In the fields beyond, the crows watched with black, unblinking eyes. They had grown fat these past weeks. Now they waited, their feathers ruffled by the hot wind blowing from the pyre, waiting, as they always did, for the fire to burn itself out, for the silence to return. And in the ashes, when the last ember cooled, something unexpected would remain. Not bones, not charred wood, but a single, unbroken bell, fallen from its tower to lie amidst the ruins. Its voice stilled, but its message echoing across the empty fields. For even in death there is dignity. Even in fire there is light. The last loaf sat untouched. Its crust hardened in the stale air of the blacksmith's cottage, the once warm scent of rye now mingling with the acrid tang of sickness. No one reached for it. No one had the strength to break bread when every breath might be their last. Eldenbrook had become a village of ghosts before its time. Sunlight filtered weakly through shuttered windows, painting stripes of pale gold across floors where children once played. Now those same floors held only the restless turning of the sick, their fevered dreams murmuring through thin walls. Henrik, the blacksmith, knelt beside his youngest son, Joran. The boy's face glistened in the dim light, his skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp for a child of 7 winters. Henrik dipped a cloth in the basin, watching the water darken with each pass over his son's brow. The linen had grown stiff with dried sweat and something else, the salty residue of countless tears. Outside, the rhythmic hammering continued. Not the familiar ring of iron on anvil that had marked Henrik's days for 20 years, but the dull thud of nails biting into pine, coffin after coffin taking shape in the carpenter's yard. Too many, always too many. A cough rattled from the corner where Henrik's wife lay. Her breathing had grown shallow, her once strong hands now clutching at the blanket with skeletal fingers. She met her husband's eyes, and in that silent exchange passed all the words they would never say. As dusk painted the village in shades of violet and gray, the elders gathered in what remained of the meeting house. Their voices, once firm with authority, now cracked like dry parchment. "We cannot dig fast enough," rasped old Ulrich, his hands trembling where they gripped his walking stick. "The graveyard is full," added Marta, the midwife, her healer's hands folded in her lap like wounded birds.
A silence fell, heavier than the church bell that no longer rang. Then came the words they'd all been thinking.
fire. It was Henrik who said it first. The man who had spent his life mastering flame now proposed its final, terrible use. No one objected. No one had the strength left for arguments. That night, as the first torches touched thatch, a lone figure stood apart from the others. Greta, the miller's widow, wrapped her arms around herself as if holding her soul inside. She watched the flames climb with dry eyes, her face illuminated by the glow of her dying world. No tears, no prayers, only silence. And in that silence, something unexpected. The first notes of a lullaby drifting from a burning cottage. A mother's final gift to her child as the flames drew near. The melody hung in the smoke-choked air, pure and heartbreaking, until at last it too was swallowed by the roar of the fire. By dawn, only the stone foundations remained, their outlines blackened and cracked like ancient runes. The field stood empty, the river flowed on, and high above a single crow circled, its shadow passing over the ashes of a village that had chosen to write its own ending. But endings, like fires, leave embers, and where there are embers, there is always the chance of new flame. The river remembered. For generations, its clear waters had carried life to Eldenbrook, silver flashes of trout beneath the surface, merchant barges laden with goods, the splashing laughter of children on its banks. Now it carried death. The first body surfaced at dawn, face down in the reeds, its sleeves billowing like the pale weeds that once decorated May Day crowns. No one waded in to retrieve it. No one dared. The sickness had claimed their river now, as it had claimed their homes, their breath, their future. Lena, the miller's daughter, knelt at the water's edge, her reflection fractured by the current. At 15, her eyes already held the weight of a woman twice her age. She tied a scrap of linen over her nose and mouth, a useless shield against the invisible enemy, and turned back toward the village with her basket of vinegar bowls. Each doorstep she visited told the same story. Shutters drawn tight against the world, the stench of sickness seeping through cracks in the walls, hollow-eyed faces peering out at her, their gratitude wordless as they accepted their pitiful offerings. "Will it help?" croaked old Thomas through his cottage door. Lena hesitated, her fingers tightening around the clay bowl. "It can't hurt," she lied. The vinegar would do nothing. They both knew it. The last physician came at noon, his once fine robe singed at the hem from fires he'd set in other doomed villages. He didn't dismount, merely shouted instructions from horseback before spurring his exhausted mare onward. His eyes, as they met Lena's, held no hope, only the grim certainty of a man who'd seen this story play out too many times. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the river blood red, the villagers gathered in silence. What little they could carry was bundled in rough cloth, a wooden spoon here, a child's doll there, the fragments of lives they would never rebuild. No words passed between them. None were needed. The first torch arced through the twilight like a falling star, landing on the thatch of the empty bakery. Flames licked hungrily at the dry straw, spreading faster than the plague itself. It was Henrik who threw it. The same hands that had once cradled his newborn daughter now consigned her memory to the fire. His face, illuminated by the growing inferno,
showed no grief, only the terrible emptiness of a man who had nothing left to lose. The flames did not discriminate. They consumed the hovels of the poor and the sturdy homes of the wealthy with equal fervor. The church bell, silent for days, finally spoke again as its wooden supports gave way, a single mournful toll as it crashed through the burning roof. Lena stood apart, watching as the firelight danced in the dark water of the mill pond. The reflection twisted and writhed like the souls of the damned. In its shimmering surface she saw not death, but release. As the last building collapsed in a shower of sparks, a gust of wind carried embers across the river. They glowed briefly against the night sky, tiny fleeting stars, before winking out in the cold water. The current carried them away, just as it had carried everything else. And on the far bank, unseen by the survivors, a single green shoot pushed through the scorched earth.
The smell came first. Sweet, cloying, wrong. Like overripe fruit left to rot in the summer sun. But beneath that sickly sweetness lurked something darker, something that clung to the back of the throat and refused to let go. The air in Eldenbrook had become thick with it, a visible miasma that hung between the half-timbered houses like a funeral shroud. Once these lanes had rung with the clamor of daily life, the clatter of wooden clogs on cobbles, the sing-song calls of fishwives, the rhythmic thump of the fuller's batons in the stream. Now only silence remained, broken occasionally by the heart-wrenching wail of a mother mourning her child, or the wet, ragged breathing of men who would not see another sunrise. In the walls, unseen but ever present, came the relentless scratching of rats. They moved boldly now, their dark bodies slinking through the shadows with impunity, feasting on what the plague had left behind. Mayor Aldrich stood in the empty market square, his fine woolen tunic, once a symbol of his station, now hanging loose on his gaunt frame. In his shaking hands, a crumpled letter bore the wax seal of the neighboring town. The words blurred before his tired eyes, but their meaning burned clear. By order of the bailiff, none from Eldenbrook shall pass our gates. The parchment slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the dust like a dead leaf. No help would come, no miracle would save them. The realization settled over him, heavier than his chain of office had ever been. As the sun dipped low, painting the plague-stricken village in hues of blood and gold, the survivors emerged from their homes. They moved like ghosts, their hollow eyes reflecting the dying light. Each carried what fragments of their lives they could not bear to leave behind. A miller's wife clutched a handful of grain in her apron, not for eating, but for planting, should she ever find safe ground. A carpenter pressed his dead daughter's wooden doll to his chest, the paint worn smooth from years of small hands loving it. A young woman sheared a lock of her lover's hair with shaking hands, the golden strands curling around her fingers like living things. No words were spoken as the torches were lit. No prayers were offered to a God who had clearly turned his face away. Only silence, thick and heavy as the plague air itself. The first flame touched the thatch of the empty tavern, then the weaver's cottage, then the schoolhouse, where children's laughter had once echoed. The fire spread with terrifying hunger, its orange tongues licking at the twilight sky. It was not anger that drove them, not fear, but something deeper, more profound. The terrible understanding that some darknesses cannot be outrun. Some horrors must be faced head-on, even if that facing means destruction. Last to burn was the maypole. Its ribbons, once bright heralds of spring's promise, now curling into blackened ash. The colored strands twisted in the heat like living things, their final dance illuminated against the gathering dark. As the flames reached their zenith, a strange peace settled over the survivors. In the orange glow, their faces were no longer masks of grief, but of quiet acceptance. The fire would cleanse. The fire would remember. And when, at last, the timbers collapsed in a shower of sparks, sending embers spiraling upward to dance among the stars, the villagers turned as one toward the forest road. Behind them, Eldenbrook burned. Before them, only the unknown.